The early morning darkness clung to the Honolulu International Airport as United Airlines Flight 811 taxied toward runway 8R, its powerful Pratt & Whitney engines humming in a steady, rhythmic drone. It was February 24, 1989, and aboard the Boeing 747-122 were 337 souls, 328 passengers and 9 crew members, each unaware that they were minutes away from the unimaginable. Inside the first-class cabin, passengers settled into their wide, cushioned seats, sipping on pre-departure drinks. Businessmen adjusted their ties, flight attendants moved through the aisles with professional grace, and the soft chime of the seatbelt sign echoed through the aircraft. Up in the cockpit, Captain David Cronin, a veteran pilot with over 35,000 flight hours, adjusted his headset and glanced at his co-pilot, First Officer Al Slater. The flight engineer, Mark Thomas, monitored the instruments, ensuring the systems were functioning optimally. Honolulu Tower, United 811. Ready for departure. Cronin radioed, his voice steady. United 811. Cleared for takeoff, runway 8R, came the reply. The massive aircraft roared down the runway, its nose lifting gracefully into the air. The lights of Honolulu blurred beneath them as the aircraft climbed past 22,000 feet, heading for Auckland, New Zealand. Everything seemed normal, until it wasn't. The unthinkable. A sharp mechanical groan vibrated through the fuselage. A sudden, ear-splitting boom exploded from the right side of the plane. In an instant, chaos erupted. The forward cargo door, located just beneath the first-class section, had violently separated from the aircraft. In its wake, a massive section of fuselage was torn away, creating a gaping hole in the side of the plane. The decompression was instant, an invisible force ripping through the cabin. Passengers in the first-class section had no warning. One moment, they were seated comfortably. The next, they were gone, yanked from their seats by the unforgiving vacuum of the sky. The deafening roar of rushing wind filled the cabin, drowning out the terrified screams. Captain Cronin's head jerked back as the explosion rattled the cockpit. The aircraft shuddered violently, its nose pitching downward. Lights flickered. The instrument panel was suddenly a sea of red warnings. "Jesus Christ!" Slater shouted, gripping the yoke. "We've lost part of the plane." Cronin forced his mind into focus. The controls felt sluggish, unresponsive. The plane was in a rapid descent. Oxygen masks dangled from the ceiling, flapping wildly in the wind, rushing through the aircraft. "Emergency descent! Get us down to 10,000, Cronin ordered, his voice strained against the howling turbulence. The air temperature inside the plane plummeted instantly. Moisture crystallized into ice. The remaining passengers, strapped into their seats, gasped for air. Flight attendants clung to anything they could, their uniforms whipping against their bodies. In the gaping hole where the fuselage had been, wires and insulation flapped like tattered ribbons. The sky beyond was a dark abyss, swirling with debris. From the aircraft, seats, papers, luggage, everything that wasn't secured had been swallowed by the void. Fighting for survival, Flight Engineer Thomas frantically scanned the instruments. "We've lost engines 3 and 4. Electrical failure on multiple systems," he reported. Cronin's grip tightened on the yoke. The plane was still controllable, but barely. "We need to turn back. Get me a vector to Honolulu." Slater, hands trembling but steady, tuned the radio. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. United 811. We've had an explosive decompression, structural damage. Request emergency landing, Honolulu." The response was instant. United 811. Honolulu approach. Copy. Descend to 10,000 feet. Runway 8L is clear for emergency return. Cronin exhaled, barely hearing the reply over the howling wind. He knew they had to act fast. They had lost power in the right side engines, and the aircraft was bleeding altitude faster than they could control. In the passenger cabin, those who had survived clutched each other in terror. An older man gripped his wife's hand so tightly that their fingers turned white. A flight attendant crawled down the aisle checking for injuries, her body pressed against the floor to avoid being thrown around. Near the gaping hole, a young man clung to his seat, his eyes wide in disbelief. The space where his travel companion had been sitting was now empty, just open sky beyond the jagged remains of the fuselage. "Hold on! Just hold on!" a flight attendant shouted, her voice barely audible over the wind. Back in the cockpit, the landing gear warning light flickered. "Another problem. We might not have full gear deployment," Thomas warned. "With all this damage, we don't know what else might fail." "We're bringing her in regardless," Cronin said, determination etched into every syllable. A miraculous landing. The island of Oahu appeared in the distance, its runway lights glowing like a beacon of salvation. The 747 limped through the sky, its damaged engines struggling, its airframe battered and wounded but still holding together. Cronin gritted his teeth. "Flaps to 20. Slower descent. I want full control." Slater adjusted the controls, his hands moving with precision. The aircraft shook violently as it dropped through the final 1,000 feet. "Brace for impact." A flight attendant's voice rang through the remaining cabin speakers. Passengers curled forward, gripping their seats. The runway rushed toward them. Cronin held his breath. Then, impact. The wheels hit the tarmac with a bone-jarring thud, the landing gear straining but holding. The damaged aircraft lurched forward, tires screeching, engines reversing thrust with whatever power they had left. Inside, the cabin, the force of deceleration slammed passengers into their seats. Overhead compartments, weakened from the explosion, burst open, spilling luggage onto the floor. For what felt like an eternity, the aircraft roared down the runway, until finally, mercifully, it came to a shuddering halt. Silence. Then the cries of relief. Fire trucks and emergency vehicles rushed toward them, flashing lights reflecting off the battered fuselage. The emergency slides deployed. Passengers stumbled into the fresh Hawaiian air, some weeping, others in silent shock. In the cockpit, Cronin exhaled deeply, his hands still gripping the yoke. "We made it," Slater whispered, his voice barely audible. Aftermath and questions as. The passengers and crew were escorted to safety. Investigators swarmed the scene. The sight of the aircraft was chilling. The forward fuselage torn open, wiring and insulation hanging limply, first-class seats exposed to the elements. The world would later learn that the cargo door's faulty locking mechanism had caused it to detach mid-flight, leading to the catastrophic decompression. 9 passengers had been pulled from the aircraft, lost to the abyss of the Pacific Ocean. Their seats, torn from the floor, had disappeared along with them. United 8111 had been minutes from complete structural failure. Had Cronin and his crew not reacted with the precision of seasoned aviators, the plane would never have made it back. For the survivors, the flight would forever be a defining moment, a brush with death, a testament to the thin line between life and tragedy at 22,000 feet. And for the aviation industry, United 811 would serve as a haunting reminder. One small failure could lead to disaster in the skies. The once proud Boeing 747 now sat lifeless on the tarmac, its torn fuselage illuminated by the strobing red and blue of emergency vehicles. The gaping wound in the aircraft, a monstrous jagged void where the first-class cabin had been, was a silent testament to the night's horror. The wind whispered through the torn metal, a ghostly sound that sent shivers down the spines of those who stood inspecting the damage. Captain David Cronin remained in his seat, his hands still gripping the yoke. His body refused to believe that. It was over. The adrenaline had carried him through the landing, but now, in the eerie stillness of the cockpit, it began to dissipate, leaving behind a crushing weight. He turned to his co-pilot, Al Slater, who sat frozen in his seat, his knuckles white. Cronin exhaled, breaking the silence. "We're alive," Slater blinked as if just now realizing it. Yeah, we are. He looked at flight engineer, Mark Thomas, who was still staring at the flickering warnings on the instrument panel as if willing them to turn off. The intercom crackled, a voice from the cabin, trembling but controlled. "Captain, we've got passengers evacuating now. Some injuries, but we lost people." Cronin's stomach tightened. He had known it, felt it the moment the decompression hit. But hearing it aloud made it real. He unbuckled his harness and rose to his feet, suddenly feeling the weight of every one of his 53 years. Chaos on the tarmac outside, the survivors gathered in small groups, wrapped in emergency blankets handed out by first responders. Some were dazed, staring at the plane in disbelief, while others sobbed into their hands. A woman clung to a flight attendant's arm, her face streaked with tears. "He was right next to me," she whispered, voice hollow. "We were talking, and then he was gone." The flight attendant, her name tag reading Nancy Reynolds, held. The woman's shaking hands, trying to keep herself from breaking down. She had seen it happen. The explosive force, the way the night sky had opened up and taken people. One moment, the man in seat 3A had been laughing, sipping his drink. The next, he had been ripped from existence, swallowed by the cold abyss. Nancy forced herself to focus. She had to be strong, for the passengers, for herself. A few feet away, a father knelt beside his teenage daughter, wrapping his arms around her. "You're okay, sweetheart. We're okay." His voice wavered, betraying the terror still coursing through him. Nearby, a young man named Daniel Carrington stood alone, staring at the remains of the first-class cabin. He had been seated near the breach, just a few feet away from those who were lost. Survivor's guilt crashed over him like a tidal wave. Why them and not me? A soft voice pulled him from his thoughts. "You should sit down." Daniel turned to see a paramedic, Maya Ishida, her name patch red, offering him a bottle of water. Her dark eyes were filled with quiet understanding. "I'm fine," he muttered, but his voice betrayed him. It shook. Maya didn't push. She simply stood beside him, offering silent solidarity. Authorities arrive before long. Representatives from the National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the Federal Aviation Administration, FAA, arrived on site, their faces grim. Among them was Robert Jensen, a senior investigator with over 20 years of experience dissecting aviation disasters. He had seen wreckage before, but something about this sent an uneasy shiver down his spine. "Jesus," he muttered, taking in the gaping hole in the fuselage. "That's not just decompression damage, that's structural failure." Beside him, Linda Garcia, another investigator, nodded. "We need to get inside, start assessing the damage." As the two approached the aircraft, they caught sight of Captain Cronin stepping onto the tarmac. His uniform was disheveled, his normally sharp demeanor dulled by exhaustion. Jensen extended a hand. "Captain, I'm Robert Jensen with the NTSB. We're here to figure out what happened." Cronin took the handshake, his grip firm despite the fatigue. "We lost the forward cargo door. That's where it started." Jensen exchanged a look with Garcia. "You're sure?" Cronin's jaw tightened. "Damn sure. The second I heard the explosion, I knew it wasn't an engine. It felt wrong. And when I saw the instruments, cabin pressure dropping instantly, electrical failures, I knew we had lost a section of the aircraft." Jensen scribbled notes, nodding. "All right, we'll get the flight data recorder and start piecing this together." He hesitated before adding, "You did good up there, Captain. You saved a lot of lives." Cronin's expression remained unreadable. "Not enough." Jensen had no response to that. The cargo door mystery. Inside a secured hangar, mechanics and investigators gathered around the recovered cargo door, which had been found floating in the Pacific hours earlier. It had been retrieved by a Coast Guard team, its metal frame twisted and battered. Jensen ran a gloved hand over the locking mechanism. It didn't take long to see the problem. "Here," he muttered, pointing to the latches. "See this? The locking mechanism didn't engage properly." Garcia leaned in, studying the damaged locks. If the door wasn't fully secured, the pressure differential could have forced it open mid-flight. Jensen exhaled. It wasn't just a random failure. This was a known issue. He flipped through the reports in his hands. There were previous incidents with these cargo doors. One on a Pan Am flight, another on a Continental aircraft. They were supposed to fix it, but he gestured at the mangled door. Clearly, it wasn't enough. Garcia clenched her jaw. 9 people died because of this. And it could have been everyone, Jensen added darkly. Confronting the truth days later in a press conference, United Airlines and Boeing executives sat behind a long table, cameras flashing. Reporters fired questions relentlessly. Was this a maintenance failure? Why wasn't the issue with the cargo doors addressed before this incident? Will Boeing be held accountable? A spokesperson for United cleared his throat. "We are cooperating fully with the NTSB to understand what happened. Our thoughts are with the families of those we lost." In the back of the room, Daniel Carrington clenched his fists. Thoughts wouldn't bring back the people who had vanished into the night. Beside him, Nancy Reynolds whispered, "They're not going to take responsibility." Daniel's eyes burned. "Then we make them." The legacy of Flight 819. In the months that followed, United 811 became a rallying cry for airline safety reform. The NTSB's final report confirmed what the investigators had suspected. The faulty cargo door locking mechanism had caused the disaster. Boeing was forced to redesign the 747's cargo doors, and mandatory inspections were implemented across all airlines. For many survivors, life was never the same. Nightmares haunted them. The sound of an overhead bin slamming shut could send them spiraling back into that moment of terror at 22,000 feet. But they also found strength. Nancy Reynolds continued working as a flight attendant, vowing to always keep a careful eye on safety measures. Daniel Carrington became an advocate for aviation safety, ensuring that the voices of those lost were never forgotten. And Captain David Cronin? He retired shortly after the incident, forever haunted by the faces of the 9 passengers who had been there one moment and gone the next. United 811 should have been just another routine flight. Instead, it became a warning, one written in shattered metal, lost lives, and a near catastrophe that should have never happened. And yet, against all odds, 328 people survived. Because even in the face of disaster, some miracles still happen.